very strong at. Hi Andrea, very nice to have you here tonight.
Thank you for having me.
We just watched about 2 minutes of your short film, and it's more like an experimental short film than a real documentary. How did you come up with the idea?
Well, you know, I knew I wanted to do something that addressed the riots that happened in 2015 in America, both in Ferguson and in Baltimore. And quite frankly, I came up with a few pieces that just weren't working. You know, pieces that incorporated still photography and animation, and quite frankly, some things that were outside of my depth. And then I was at a workshop in Treviso, Italy, working at Fabrica, and I was working on this project. And the instructor basically asked me, you know, why is this important to you? And as soon as he said that, it kind of clicked in my head, like I saw what I wanted to say. And I could visualize it in a way that hadn't made sense before. And so when he said, why is this important to you? You know, I instantly thought about the idea of a self, you know, looking into a mirror and reflecting on the things that you see in that mirror. And I knew that I wanted it to be, you know, a singular person, a singular African-American person, a singular Black person from America. And that instead of having that mirror there, the person in the piece would be confronting the viewer, and that you wouldn't be able to negate their gaze, like you were stuck there looking at that person and really kind of going through something with this person. And so I started to think about the way in which I consumed the material. You know, how had I learned about the different police brutalities that were becoming so much more commonplace in America? And how did I learn about the riots? And the way that I learned about it was through the news, you know, and watching it on TV. And we also consume news in so many different ways, you know. It's not just on the TV, it's online, it's on your phone. And so I thought about that, and then every time I would be confronted with this information, it was jarring. You know, I got angry, I was sad, I was upset. You know, to see and to hear the different things that are happening, you know, like the glass that's breaking, people are screaming, people are angry, people are crying. Then I knew that I wanted to take that and create that feeling in the video. So then I was also continually talking through the project, and then one of the people that I was talking with said, you know, it would be awesome just to see the reflection of you watching the TV. And so the video itself is completely lit by a computer screen, and I'm just, you know, a few feet away from the computer screen, but that's the only light that's flashing on my face to create the light for the piece.
So I understand normally you're behind the camera and take picture of people, and in that moment you're basically the subject sitting in front of a camera. What did that do to you?
Oh man, well, I was terrified, to be honest, because in my still photography, I started as a still photographer, and I would always like approach people on the streets and like try to get to know their story, and strangers, and you know, I feel 100% comfortable doing that and like approaching people in that way. And but to have myself as the subject of this piece, a controversial piece at that, and then also, you know, subject myself to scrutiny and also just be vulnerable, terrified me. I mean, I didn't want to do it, but I knew that like the purpose was greater than the fear. And I knew that I wanted to communicate something. So what ended up happening, I was in Italy, and I had a finite amount of time to get it done. And I felt impassioned to do the work and to get it done. And in Italy, I mean, I was the only African American at the place, you know, and African American in general. I mean, there were probably Africans in Italy somewhere, but I didn't feel comfortable approaching them about this piece. And so I knew that I wanted to say some specific things, and at the end of the day, it had to be me. And ultimately, I think it worked out because, you know, when he asked me to think about why it was important to me, I am talking about ideas that are important to myself. So the fact that I'm the one who's putting them out there, I think it ultimately makes sense.
So let us talk a bit also about the process, how you created that video. So when I watched it for the first time, I was wondering, okay, is she like reacting directly to what is happening on the screen, or is it more kind of a collage, or how many people were with you in the room, how direct was the emotion, all these things that you wonder when you're just like watching the video. How did you do it?
So I knew that the sound was the way in which I wanted to create the narrative for the piece, so I started with the sound. But what I did was I went on YouTube and I sourced a bunch of clips for different riots and things that had happened in Baltimore and in Ferguson. Ones that I thought were jarring emotionally when I watched them or heard the different sounds. And then I also juxtaposed that with different pundits and different activists speaking about racial plight in America and the institutionalization of racism that has happened in America. And so what I did was I took the audio out, I stripped the audio, and then I created the edited piece that you hear there. And after that, I went into the studio late at night in Italy where I was working, and I had my digital SLR was my camera of choice. And I set it up just above the actual screen that I was looking at, and then I just played on a loop on YouTube different riots that were happening, so I could try to emote, you know, what I wanted to emote. And honestly, I didn't actually listen to the audio when I created the piece. I listened to music when I was creating the piece. So, and I played different things. Like I played gospel music. I played different rap music and different things that talked about America. You know, John Legend's music that the glory, you know, always gets me when it talks about the search for equality that African Americans are looking for in America and how we haven't quite yet reached that. You know, it always makes me emotional. So I gathered the songs that made me emotional, and ultimately, you know, I was able to emote something for the climax of the piece.
So you kind of had an idea what emotion or what reaction you want to have in the piece?
Yeah, I mean, I knew that I wanted it to be like a slow burn, if you will, and for the audience to kind of go on a journey where you're wondering, like, why isn't this person reacting? Like, all this stuff is happening, and she's just, like, totally desensitized, it seems. And then ultimately you see, you know, slowly that it's that I'm internalizing it. Like, it's still happening, but I'm not outwardly, you know, getting emotional. And so I thought that it was fitting that it wasn't like a scream or a cry at the end, that it was, you know, just a couple of tears, and then I pick my head up and I keep it moving, because that's ultimately what has to happen if you are going to survive.
So basically what you live in that piece, or what happens to you in that piece, is that kind of a metaphor or a picture, or what happens to many people in the U.S.?
Well, I can't say what happens to many people. I don't claim to know that, but I know what happens in my own experience. And I do know, you know, just even the conversation about some of the racist things that might happen to my friends and myself. We talk about it all the time. You know, things that might happen at work, or things that might happen on the bus or on the train or whatever. And, you know, and sometimes we're very flippant about it. You know, because if you get angry all the time, then you wouldn't get anything done or be able to do the things that you want to do. So, yeah, I don't know if I answered that question or not, but yeah.
But so this, like you say, sometimes you get flipping about it, but you obviously don't always get upset about it. But is it more that like silently getting angry on it somehow?
I think you're always angry, you know, when something happens. But then a lot of times you're just like, whatever, this is how it is. I mean, that's life in America for an African American person to experience racism at one point or another, or multiple points. So you just keep going.
So in that scene? Like, you weren't part of the riots, you weren't at the place where the riots took place, but still you were, as an African American, somehow part of what was happening in these riots or in these police shootings or in the racist happenings. So is that kind of, as we talk here about this me and we and my role in society, is that kind of your me, we moment, this sunset?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, in the culture that we live in today, I mean, there's something happening like every week, you know, in the world, but you're not necessarily there, but it does somehow affect you. And I think for this piece, you know, yes, it is me that's in the piece, and some of the stuff is personal, but in all of my work, I like for there to be a sense of universality that exists, you know, with the human experience where, you know, I think everybody knows what it feels like to feel unheard or, you know, to feel disenfranchised or, and to really be stifled by that feeling. And then, you know, you can either express it or implode or however you deal with it, it does surface at some point in time. So with that being said, you know, I am the person in the picture or in the movie, but ultimately I would think that people can relate to the feelings that are being expressed and the emotions.
What reactions did you get on that
From the piece? I think there are so many. I think sometimes there are people who just feel uncomfortable and they're just like, okay, I'm gonna get up and walk out. And then there are people who are, I guess, touched by it, but they don't know how to express it. And then there are people who are very easily able to express it, like, you know, people who have seen it and have grown up in the South or a segregated South will come up to me and say, this reminded me of the time when I grew up and this reminded me of this. And so ultimately, I mean, at the end of it, there's usually a conversation. You know, people will come up to me and say it affected me in some way, but it definitely varies from person to person.
Like the very last thing you listen to in that piece is, we can't anymore see your face, but just hear that lady, I guess it's a phone call or something, and she's saying, I just want to repeat that because it kind of struck me.
Yep.
I wanted to ask the colored man, why don't colored people, instead of saying what we did to them, why don't they say what we did for them? We can't see any reaction from you in the film on that. What are your thoughts on that question, and why did you put it to the end? Because I mean, that's what stays in one's mind.
Well, you know, when I heard that for the first time, I thought it was laughable. I was just like, is she serious? And I was just like, wow, that really sums up the way that I think a lot of European people feel in America, like white people in America. Because sometimes they just don't see that it's still there. You know, that the oppression is so ingrained in our society that they don't even see the lack of privilege that other people don't have. And I think that they believe, not all, but that some believe that we're starting from the same ground, and that's not necessarily the case. And so I thought that was really important to put in there because I think all of those things really illustrate the effect of institutional racism and how it can really deteriorate, you know, a person.
So that was 2015. Now you have Trump elected, and kind of in some parts a whole different discussion about racism, I would say, in America. What do you think about that now?
About what she said?
Do you have the feeling that's more common sense to some people now, or people would say more open?
I think that there are people who do believe that, and I think that in this election that it was proven that there are a lot of people who feel that way, and that that there's a certain level of opportunity that's been afforded to people of color that is not necessarily so. And so you have this other side of people who are trying to take that back, you know, whatever they feel like they've lost. When the reality is that, you know, they haven't lost anything. You know, they haven't lost the privileges that they already had. and they feel like they have, and I don't know if that's the cause of having an African American president before this president or not, but you have a sense of people feeling angry and they feel disenfranchised, which to me doesn't really make sense. And I think that if they were, to have the history and the education, then they would know that they do have the opportunities that they had before, if not more than certain people of color. So it's interesting to see, with this election, what that has brought out in people, and quite frankly, it's disheartening. When I went to vote in this election, there was just so much hate, that was like permeating through America, and it's still there. I mean, it's we're divided. People say that all the time. But, when I went to vote, I actually live most of the time in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So, and it's a predominantly white place. And so, which is not foreign to me. I've lived in predominantly white places many times before. But going into the polls for the first time to vote, I thought to myself, I saw all these different white people who were voting, and which is not uncommon because I live in a white neighborhood. But I thought to myself as I was going up to the polls, like, wow, I wonder, does that person hate me? I had never thought that before. And so this election really kind of brought that out. And I was looking at people thinking like, oh, I wonder, do you feel that way? Do you feel the way that lady was talking in the end of the piece? So it was not a good feeling, but I did my duty, and I voted and did what I had to do, and then the next day woke up and here we are.
But would you say it, like the last year, changed something? You experienced more open racism perhaps, or more segregation, more separation, or is it less bad than you thought before?
No, because I think if you're African American in America, you knew that it was already there. Like, that wasn't a question. I think that people were so emboldened to talk about it and like put it in your face was something people hadn't experienced since the 60s. I personally had not experienced any of that, and my parents actually came from the South, and my mom, I think, went to a segregated school. So my mom is from Paris, Texas, and my dad is from Hot Springs, Arkansas. I don't know if I said that right, but so they're both from the Deep South, and so they've grown up with a lot of like overtly racist things that would happen to them. And so, I called my dad the next day after the election trying to make sense of it because, it was really painful. It was painful to see that people had voted for this ideology. And so I called him and we talked for a little bit, and he said, this ain't nothing we haven't been through before. Like, this is not new. We've been through it before with Nixon and other presidents. Like, we got through that, we're going to get through this. And so, I just took that and I was like, yeah, you're right.
So when we come to the title of our talk tonight, that is called When Living is a Protest. Is that video clip, is that your kind of protest somehow too?
I don't know if I'd necessarily call it a protest, but I want it to be an education for people to understand, that when someone is rioting, there's a lot more behind that than just, oh, I'm angry and I want to, fuck shit up. I want to hurt something, I want to break something, I want to loot something. The reality is that, that's years of anger and pain and being disenfranchised. And I want people to really just kind of look at it and see, what part do they play in it, if any. And so, I don't know if I would call it a protest, but I would just call it a source of education or something like that.
But you kind of call it a controversial piece, so
it's
at least you kind of want a reaction.
Yeah, I do want that. I want people to feel something. and I can't tell them what to feel, but I can guide that experience. But I don't ultimately want everybody to walk away with the same feeling, because not everybody has the same experiences that they're bringing to the viewing of the piece.
So this is like one important part of your work, but
Yeah.
you're also working as a photographer, and I would kind of like to focus a bit on that too, because you did another very interesting series of pictures called The Streets Are Talking, and you took them after another series of like police killing black men in basically your neighborhood, more or less, or?
Yeah, so I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and so I had created the first piece, Unsighted, the video, in 2015 in the summer. And then I was thinking to myself, I gotta get this work out, I gotta get it out, because this won't be happening forever. And then I got home, and a few months later, there was a killing of Jamar Clark, an unarmed black man in Minneapolis. And so that resulted in protesters like overtaking the police station, like completely for a month at a time. And they had camped out, and they had vigils, and I mean, it was just amazing to see. And so I was like, I wonder, let me go down and just kind of see why people feel it's important to be here. And so I didn't really have a real agenda. I wanted people to tell their own stories. So, I went down there, with my Hasselblad, and then with my little audio recorder, because I wanted to pair their story with the actual still photograph. And so some of these photos are the result of that. And then I kept going with the project, and I met people in their homes and things like that. And then not too long after that, there was the shooting death of Philando Castile, which happened in a suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota, which is, the Twin Cities are one and the same. And I mean, that just like rocked the world, because people were able to see what was happening, visually, live on Facebook. And so, when
his girlfriend streamed it live on Facebook right after the shooting.
Yeah, she did. And so, when cases of police brutality were coming up, like even in 2015, it wasn't like that was a surprise to me, or really, I think anyone in the African American community, that was happening. But I think now, people have the opportunity to see it because everybody has a cell phone and everybody's documenting, constantly. And so that's what happened with, Philando Castile, and it was like a really shocking moment, but it helped to change some things. It helped to bring it to the forefront. And so some of the pictures you see here, like this picture was taken at his repast for Philando Castile. That was at the precinct in Minneapolis, again at the precinct in Minneapolis. But some of the pictures, you'll see a mix between the two instances that happened in the Twin Cities.
So you always also created a little video out of that with the sound. Perhaps we could have a look at that too, because it's kind of special that you really hear the people you see.